This is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast with historian Stephen Ujifusa. Business, history, and culture with a nautical twist. Today on this episode of Wet Lunch on the High Seas, I'm going to discuss one of the most intriguing characters I've ever researched. He was a Chinese merchant named Wu Pingchen, known by the Americans and British by the pidgin name of Houqua. Houqua was born in 1769 and died in 1843, and he was the leader of the so-called Cohong, a group of 12 or so Chinese merchants who were allowed to do business with foreign traders. And he was something of a mentor and godfather to a small group of Americans who during the early 19th century spent 5 to 10 years in China to earn their fortune. His family owned some of the most valuable tea plantations in China, and sometime in his career, around 1835 or so, he decided to do business only with the Americans. And this group of Americans, which included Warren Delano II, who was incidentally Franklin Delano Roosevelt's maternal grandfather, and John Murray Forbes of Boston, they worshipped and revered him. And in fact, Houqua eventually would entrust over $500,000 of his own money to be invested by John Murray Forbes back in America, who put that money to work in enterprises such as mining and railroads. So this was almost certainly the first instance of Chinese venture capital being invested in the United States. So this is not a new thing. Houqua would send each of his proteges, or his American sons as he called them, portraits of himself that they would take home and hang in their mansions in Boston or New York or the Hudson Valley or Newport, Rhode Island. It was a signal to those in the know that the owners of these portraits were in a very, very elite fraternity. It signaled status. It was also, in an era before Zoom, a way that Houqua could virtually keep an eye out on his American sons halfway around the world, a reminder of what he had taught them. I'd like to read a short excerpt of Barons of the Sea that explains this relationship that these Americans had to Wu Pingchen and the connections that he forged with them. No member of the Cohong Guild was more important than its leader, the mighty Wu Pingchen, known to foreigners as Houqua. In portraits, a slight man with a wispy white beard and rather sad eyes, Houqua was in life a Mandarin powerhouse, paying no mind to the dictates of the ancient Confucian social hierarchy, in which a merchant had no standing. Bedecked in shimmering silk robes and clattering jade necklaces, he met and entertained the Fangqi merchants so hated in China, building his fortune by selling, buying, and making loans against the foreigners' future profits. He always made it a point to forgive debts to preserve a friendship. According to one story, when an American merchant owed him $100,000, a full competence, Houqua told the desperate young man in pidgin, "You and I are number one often. You belong honest man. Only no got chance." He then opened his safe, ripped up the promissory notes, and threw them in the trash. "Just now have seti counter. Ali finishy. You go, you please." Eventually worth $26 million, Houqua became by far the richest merchant and perhaps the richest non-sovereign in the world. However, his position was not without risk. As head of the Cohong, he was held personally responsible by the authorities for the foreigners' good credit and law-abiding conduct. Their illicit opium trading would become a source not only of profit but of danger to him. What's more, high-born Chinese resented his getting around the ancient presumptive meritocracy. But in Canton, both Chinese and foreigners admired his mettle, brains, and money. To the Americans in Canton, Houqua held the keys to the celestial kingdom, the keys to the money. They revered him almost as if he were a deity. Perkins established a strong relationship with the great merchant early on. When Russell arrived, he too became a protege. In fact, Houqua liked Russell so much that, to the chagrin of the British, he decided to do business exclusively with the Americans, and in time with Russell's firm almost exclusively. Eventually, the numerous relations and partners of Russell and Company were to become Houqua's surrogate sons. "You know it is an ambition common to my countrymen to have many sons," he wrote one of them. As a businessman who dealt with foreigners, Houqua couldn't wholly trust his fellow Chinese, especially the government in Peking, but he could create his own fraternity of impressionable young men. The fraternity soon included Perkins' nephews, Robert and John Murray Forbes, who arrived in Canton in the 1820s to carry on in their uncle's footsteps, spending their bachelor days in China to develop connections and earn the competences they craved. The brothers were the poor relations of the Perkins clan, their father having failed as a merchant and died destitute. Robert and John had felt duty-bound to provide for their mother, the colonel's sister, and both eventually left school to go into Uncle Thomas's business. Robert, aged 13, went to sea on his uncle's ships. "He has become so useful that I really regret to let him go away," a cousin at home complained. "But as he has set out to make a sailor, it is best to let him persevere, and I will answer for his being at the top of his profession within a few years." Dashing, adventurous, a lover of sea stories, Robert Bennett Forbes rose through the ranks. Robert Bennett Forbes rose through the ranks to become a ship's captain before joining the company in Canton. Younger brother John Murray Forbes preferred to keep his nose in the ledger books. Introverted and solemn, he had received a liberal education at a boarding school in Northampton, Massachusetts. Its lessons were not merely scholarly. Remembering his school days later, John wrote, "The history of my life at Round Hill School would not be complete if I forgot fisticuffs. My notion then as now was, after Polonius's advice, avoid getting into a fight by all honorable means, but once in, so conduct the war that your adversary would not soon hanker after another." His father's death had a profound effect on John's outlook on life and business. While Robert sought adventure, John sought stability. His letters journal the intense family burden many of these young Americans felt when they left home to seek their fortunes in China. He remembered his mother's patient patching, my sister Emma's vigilant eye to our wants, corporeal and spiritual, and especially the latter on Sunday afternoon, when she always read to us our Bible and hymns. When he left Round Hill for Canton at the behest of Uncle Thomas, John must have been overwhelmed by the pressure to succeed, but at the same time he knew that his reputation and future financial stability depended on his success. "You may be sure that I shall receive your advice and wishes as to my conduct, as anything rather than those of a taskmaster, and I trust that I shall observe them more strictly than if they were so," John wrote his brother Robert in 1828, as he prepared to set sail to join Robert in Canton. "I can hardly say that I was surprised at your determination as to my going to Canton. It is true that it must be painful for me to leave all our friends here, but I feel that it is better to make any sacrifice than to be a useless member of our family." Of the two brothers, it was John who forged the closest relationship with Houqua. He even looked a little bit like a Yankee version of the great merchant, with a long pinched face, prominent nose, high forehead, and prematurely receding hair. His tact and attention to detail led Houqua to transfer all of his tea business to Russell and Company, stipulating that John Forbes handle it personally. When the younger brother John eventually returned to Boston, having made his competence in Canton, the connection with Houqua remained. As John Murray Forbes began investing his wealth into American enterprises, including the era's new transportation technology, railroads, Houqua entrusted him with a few $100,000 to invest and manage on the great merchant's behalf. To be awarded stewardship of such a huge chunk of foreign capital was unprecedented for an American businessman. And if the Russell men were masters of risk and tea speculation, they were extremely careful when it came to overseeing Houqua's fortune. "Remember, security is my first object," Houqua wrote regarding a shipment of teas and silks via Turkey. "I desire to run no unnecessary risks and want, if possible, to have the accounts closed early." From Houqua, John Murray Forbes learned the ultimate negotiating trick, as he explained to a relative. "The great art of making bargains is to find out other people's ultimatum without letting out yours, and this can be done with most people by letting them talk." Good business advice then as now. That was a short excerpt from my 2018 book, Barons of the Sea and Their Race to Build the World's Fastest Clipper Ship. An incredible relationship between the Forbes family and the Chinese merchant Houqua that had profound influences not just for the Forbes family, but also for investment in the United States. Thank you for listening to this episode of Wet Lunch on the High Seas. This is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast with historian Stephen Ujifusa. Thank you for listening. You can expect new episodes every week. To subscribe to the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast, visit steveujifusa.substack.com.